On the 21st of May 2024, a Singapore Airlines flight hits unexpected turbulence over the Irrawaddy Basin in Myanmar.
The incident happened so suddenly, we couldn't even process that it was a turbulence event.
People were screaming, people were panicking.
You know, you're thinking that you're going to die.
A sudden drop throws passengers and crew around the cabin.
People were flung from their seats to the ceiling and then back down violently.
Dozens suffer serious injuries to their heads and spines.
There's lots of people with the most horrendous gashes, blood pouring down their heads.
This film analyses minute-by-minute flight SQ321.
If I had been stood here, I would have hit the ceiling head first.
The experiences of those on board.
Everywhere you looked, somebody needed some help.
And the human resilience that ensured a safe landing.
This is the most difficult turbulence. You can't predict it, you can't see it.
It delves into the science of turbulence.
Things are warming up, and therefore there is certainly going to be an increase in turbulence.
And explores the innovations that are keeping us safe.
I've heard of stories where the wings have been bent so far around that they touched and they still haven't snapped.
With the number of serious turbulence events increasing, every airline passenger should watch this film.
It was truly one of those moments that stick in your head for the rest of your life.
Singapore Airlines flight SQ321 is about to depart from London to Singapore with 211 passengers and 18 crew members on board.
I got to the airport very early. I'm very used to travelling, so nothing seemed unusual.
What begins as an ordinary journey is about to very quickly turn into a harrowing experience.
Got into my seat, the chap next to me made conversation, as often happens. Little did I know that, a few hours later I'd be sharing such an awful experience with him.
El motivo del viaje era nuestra luna de miel. Teníamos un montón de ganas, llevábamos un montón.
The first 10 hours just flew right past, basically thinking that we're going to be home very, very soon.
Around 90 minutes from landing at their destination in Singapore, flight SQ321 is cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet above Myanmar's Irrawaddy Basin. Passengers are waking up, and breakfast is about to be served by the cabin crew. Passengers are stretching their legs and going to the bathroom. Crucially, many are not wearing their seatbelts, unaware of the dangers that lie ahead.
There wasn't a lot of warning signs. Everyone had gotten up to go to the bathroom, so everything was just very normal.
Suddenly, 10 hours into the flight, the peace is violently shattered.
And then there was just this horrendous judder and shake. Kind of immediately knew that something wasn't right.
The plane has hit severe turbulence. Without warning, it's suddenly pushed upward. The crew and passengers have no time to react.
I couldn't even process that it was turbulence. I thought that something had hit the plane, something was wrong with the engine.
Caught in an updraft, the plane is pushed up nearly 400 feet, causing severe vibrations, and passengers feel as though they are being pressed into their seats.
I remember the airplane going up, and the engines roared, and it was just so obvious that this was, early on, that this was something out of the ordinary.
I don't think there was any really clear warning signs of what was to come.
The plane is flying on autopilot, which tries to make it descend back down to its original programmed altitude of 37,000 feet. It picks up speed, so the pilot deploys the air brakes and turns on the seatbelt sign. But just 8 seconds later, things take a terrifying turn.
And then, literally, the moment my seatbelt was fastened, the plane just simply dropped.
The plane has hit more severe turbulence. But this time it drops 178 feet in just under 5 seconds.
People were flung from their seats to the ceiling.
My feet flew up into the air in front of me. I felt straining around my waist where the seatbelt was digging in. My iPad hit me on the head as it passed.
The passengers who haven't had time to belt up are thrown up to the ceiling at high speed, causing carnage in the cabin as the plane drops.
Lo que recuerdo es estar pegado en el techo ya y ver gente salir volando como yo. Y ahí, a partir de ese momento, lo que yo recuerdo es un dolor inmenso.
People were screaming and yelling, and there was this generally very strong sense of confusion.
My wife, she was having a panic attack. I was just trying to comfort her and just tell her that everything was going to be okay, but internally I was just trying to also accept that we might not make it.
Panels above seats have been smashed open, causing the oxygen mask to fall. And even lockers have been broken by the force of passengers' heads hitting them. As the plane stops descending, the people glued to the ceiling fall to the floor. So how has this just happened? The answer lies with the gravitational forces experienced because of the turbulence.
I am here, strapped into this aircraft, and I remain in motion. I am moving at the speed and the direction that the aeroplane is flying. If the aeroplane suddenly changes, my body tries to stay in the same place. So if the aeroplane suddenly descends, my body tries to stay at the height it was. And on the Singapore Airlines flight, people would have been sat down, but they would also have been stood up like me, walking around, going to the toilet behind me. So if I had been stood here, I would have hit the ceiling head first, and then as the aircraft returned to positive G, I would have come crashing down to the floor here. And of course, we've got seats, we've got people, and the injuries were almost inevitable.
A lot of the time I had my eyes closed because I thought if I did die, it would be better if I had my eyes closed. I think my brain just shut off to the reality of it.
We thought it was the end for us. I remember my life just flashed in front of my eyes, and I looked at my husband and I just saw the terror on his face.
It must have been absolutely terrifying. I've looked at the raw numbers, and at one stage, the aircraft fell 178 feet in 4.6 seconds. What's that? That is an average speed of 26 miles an hour going downwards. If you're not strapped in, that is going to be extremely serious.
The pilots manually take back control of the aircraft. The whole incident has lasted just over a minute, but has left devastation and a catalogue of passenger and crew injuries in its wake.
I looked behind me to see how everybody else was, and that was when the scale of it really hit me. So lots of people with the most horrendous gashes on their heads, blood pouring down their heads.
We just saw absolute chaos around us. The interior of the plane was like completely damaged.
It was just a wreck. It looked like a movie scene where they've had plane crashes.
A lot of flight staff were limping, they were injured. There was an individual who was sitting on the floor, so we couldn't see him, but we could see people rushing to him to get CPR done.
In the terrifying mayhem, one passenger has gone into cardiac arrest. It has now become a drastic and life-threatening situation, and the pilots must divert and land as soon as possible.
It was truly one of those moments where you feel out of control, you feel like there is nothing that you can do. We were just praying that we could make it home safely.
Many of us have experienced turbulence firsthand. But what exactly is it?
Turbulence is what happens in the air when something disturbs the smooth flow. What happens is the air is suddenly not flowing all in the same direction at the same time and the same speed. So if the airflow moves, the aeroplane will try to follow it. And that's why we get this apparently random motion of the aeroplane, which is really uncomfortable if you're in the aircraft at the time, as well as providing problems with controlling the aircraft as well as the pilot needs to.
There are three main types that can affect you if you're flying on a plane. One is, of course, the obvious one of flying through a storm. Nobody wants to do that. But also, surprisingly perhaps, flying over a mountain range can be very turbulent. And then there's a third category, which is strong air currents in what we call the jet stream can become unstable and generate an invisible kind of turbulence that we call clear air turbulence.
And it was clear air turbulence that SQ321 is believed to have hit.
The best way to describe it is if you think about a contrail that comes off an aircraft. Sometimes you can see literally it becomes really, really wiggly, and there's nothing else around to give you any indication that there might be turbulent air. But if you see a really wiggly contrail, you know that there's turbulent air there. So clear air turbulence is simply turbulence that you can't see a cause for.
Large passenger jets are equipped with weather radars in the nose of the plane, which detect bad weather ahead. But why was the clear air turbulence so hard to spot?
The clue is in the name for clear air turbulence. It's turbulence in clear air, so it's invisible. Not only is it invisible to the naked eye, but even the weather radar in the flight deck can't see it because we rely on water droplets, clouds, to reflect the radar signal back to the aircraft and be detected. So it can be hazardous. It can come, well, literally out of the blue. The first thing you know about it is when you hit it.
Back on Singapore Airlines flight SQ321, the crew were working to help the injured and restore calm.
It was like a scene from a war. Everywhere you looked, there was somebody else who needed some help, who had a cut ear, had blood down their shirt, or were crying.
The pilots have re-engaged autopilot, but throughout this frightening experience, thousands of hours of flight training will have kicked in. Every 6 months, pilots must carry out mandatory flight training for maintenance and emergency situations, including severe turbulence.
Stabilizing, setting thrust. Okay, now we'll start our left turn and we'll start tracking towards Bognor.
At Luton Airport, flight trainer Ryan Visser uses a multi-million-pound flight simulator to train pilots how to fly in disruptive clear air turbulence.
We're sitting in an Airbus A320, the simulated version of. It's a full 6-axis sim, so we have the motion platform below us. So once we start maneuvering the aircraft, we will be able to feel a simulated version of what it would be like to be on the real aircraft. As a demonstration right now, I'm going to ask Vota if he can put in some moderate turbulence for us now.
The training begins with low-level turbulence. It feels quite shaky as the plane passes through clouds on the edge of a storm.
So now you can start seeing the effects of moderate turbulence. As you can see, it's quite difficult to navigate your way around that. We'd keep it in autopilot for as long as possible. The aircraft's protections on this particular type of aircraft are very good. We've lost altitude, so that's why we got a warning. because we started losing a reasonable amount of altitude. That was 180 feet that we lost.
Ryan now does what a pilot would never usually do. He flies into the heart of the storm to demonstrate severe air turbulence, like that experienced by flight SQ321. Ryan is expecting a bumpy ride, whereas the pilots of SQ321 were taken completely by surprise as clear air turbulence is undetectable.
As the airspeed starts changing, and we're going to start losing and gaining altitude. That's 1,000 feet rate of descent. And this is the most difficult turbulence to try and, you can't predict it, you can't see it. Hence the name clear air. And 500 feet, 1,000 feet rate of climb. And this is where it's going to start getting really tricky. There we go. Okay, and that's about the most severe side of this that we could show you at this stage.
This is a simulation, but the effect on the plane is virtually the same as the clear air turbulence that hit flight SQ321. But what action would the pilots have taken?
When they realised the aircraft was hitting turbulence, probably the first thing they'd do would be to reach up here and turn on fasten seatbelt sign. The next thing they're going to be doing is disengaging the autopilot, trying to get the aircraft smoothly back onto the condition it was flying. At that point, the pilots will be just maintaining control of the aircraft. The other thing, of course, they could do is try and do their best to steer the aeroplane around or under the turbulence, and a little while later they would be reducing altitude and changing route to get the aircraft down onto the ground and getting medical attention for the people who were sadly injured on board the flight.
The pilot's actions quickly controlled the plane, although the injuries caused by the rapid changes in gravitational force as the plane shot up through the turbulence and back down again were terrible. The pilots avoided a potentially much worse experience.
The situation for the pilots of the Singapore Airlines flight was pretty challenging. It was rather a calm flight. There was this huge impact, so they had only small time to prepare the cabin. Just imagine you driving a car and you have a perfect road, you're going full speed, everything's perfect, and all of a sudden you have very bad conditions on the pavement. And this, I think, gives you some relation to how difficult, how challenging it was for the pilots.
Flight SQ321 showed how dangerous turbulence can be for passengers. But are there parts of the world where it's worse?
You would be hard-pressed to find any part of the atmosphere globally that didn't have any turbulence in it. All kinds of turbulence have the potential to be hazardous to aircraft. Some time ago, there was a cargo jet that was flying over the Rocky Mountains in the US, and it encountered some really strong turbulence. We would actually categorize it officially as extreme turbulence, which is the worst possible kind. Most pilots will never encounter it, even if they spend 40 years flying. This turbulence was so strong that mid-flight, one of the 4 engines broke off the wing. It became detached and it fell to the ground. This was really a very rare event. The plane managed to land safely, but it can happen, and it has happened.
On board flight SQ321, the cabin crew, many of whom are also hurt, are treating the injured passengers, including one British man, Geoffrey Kitchen, who has sadly had a heart attack in the chaos.
The Singapore Airlines cabin crew were only interested excuse me. The Singapore Airlines cabin crew were only interested in helping other people. They put themselves second and did what they could for everybody else who was badly injured. Sorry, didn't mean to get emotional.
Many of the passengers are traumatised by what they've just experienced. But amid the chaos, the cabin crew's job is to restore order.
In an emergency, and it depends on the emergency per se with an aircraft, but generally people fall into one of two categories. They are generally compliant and they'll follow the rules as advocated in the pre-flight safety briefing, or they panic. And that becomes irrational, and that's very hard to control for a cabin crew.
All cabin crew are trained rigorously in safety procedures and helping passengers.
No one realises what actually happens behind the scenes. Like, we're not just there to serve tea and coffee. No, we're not waitresses of the sky or anything. We are there for safety and protection. Every single time we have a flight, we have to sit down and have a briefing, and we all get spot checks on random medical questions, so we don't know what they're going to be. If you don't know the answer, they'll stand you down. So you need to know your stuff constantly.
But while cabin crew are there to keep passengers safe, they can be the most vulnerable to injury from turbulence, as they are often on their feet during a flight.
We was flying back from Cuba to Manchester. It was just a normal flight. We'd not been briefed on anything, to know anything, to expect anything untoward. And it was just normal. And as I was pushing the cat back up, it just got a bit more bumpy. As we turned the corner, we heard cabin crew be seated. And before we could even recognise what he'd just said, we shot up 500 foot, and it took 3 seconds. Unfortunately, I took a step at that time. The impact of the floor meeting my foot just snapped it. And that's when I looked down and realised that something really bad had happened.
Eden had complex fractures to her leg and ankle, caused by changing gravitational forces during similar clear air turbulence as that experienced on flight SQ321.
I spent 7.5 hours on the back row, still being attended to by the crew as well, and then they still got on with their job afterwards, which was just incredible. What the crew do, I felt so confident in knowing that I was taken care of.
Eden had 3 operations on her leg and spent 14 days in hospital. Even now, 5 years later, she still undergoes regular treatment.
Thankfully, it didn't come through my skin or anything, but I did see the bone completely snapped out, and I saw the side of my shoe. So I saw my foot was completely on its side and my bone was snapped out that way.
Unsurprisingly, all cabin crew are trained how to deal with turbulence.
As cabin crew, we are specifically trained for turbulence. We would have to go through the cabin and secure everyone and make sure bags are put away, so the captain knows that no matter how bumpy it gets, at least the cabin is secure, so no one's potentially going to get injured.
But obviously, if it's quite sudden and severe, the cabin crew will have to take their jump seats, and we can make a passenger announcement from the jump seat and tell everyone to put on their seatbelt immediately if they haven't done so already.
Although cabin crews are prepared for turbulence, passengers are not.
For some who have a fear of flying, turbulence can be quite devastating for them. In other words, white-knuckled, they will grip the seat, they will ensure that their seatbelt is fastened. So turbulence affects different people differently. And there's a lot to do with control, that they are not in control of the aircraft and they're relying on someone else to do the right thing. And in those circumstances, it generally exacerbates their fear.
Back on flight SQ321, the pilots have regained control, but request an emergency landing at the nearest large airport in Bangkok.
The pilot came onto the tannoy and said, obviously due to the multiple injuries, and we are diverting, and there will be medical staff waiting for us.
On landing, the cabin is a scene of devastation.
Only then did we realise just how extreme it was. We saw so many just like food plates, magazines just spread across the floor.
As we were led away, I stood and took a photograph of the aeroplane. It was quite extraordinary to see that huge piece of machinery sitting on the tarmac, and to think that an hour or so earlier that had been tossed around in the air like a doll. It was an extraordinary thing to see.
104 passengers have been injured, their belongings scattered everywhere. But from the outside, the plane appears intact.
It's worth remembering the damage was internal and it was caused by people making contact with surfaces of the aircraft. So it's really important to remember that the structure of the aircraft wasn't damaged as a result of the turbulence.
So how had it survived its violent battering in the skies above Myanmar?
Aircraft are designed to be structurally strong to cope with the kinds of turbulence which we expect to deal with.
And every plane has to prove it's capable of flying in hazardous conditions.
When a new aircraft model is being designed, a set of tests will be conducted. One of those is called the wing bend test, which is what it sounds like. You take the wings and bend them and make sure they can withstand more than the strongest turbulence the aircraft is ever likely to encounter.
Wings have traditionally been made out of aerospace-grade aluminium to make them strong, light and flexible. This test footage from 2013 shows the wings of an Airbus passenger plane able to bend more than 5 meters, demonstrating its ability to cope with severe turbulence. Now, manufacturers are switching to carbon fibre reinforced plastic to save further on weight and make them even more flexible.
I've heard of stories where they've been bent so far around that they touch each other and they make contact and they still haven't snapped.
Modern planes must undergo stress tests, equivalent to at least twice their projected lifespan.
In turbulent conditions, the wing can't break because the wings are designed to cope with these forces.
If I look out the window and I think, oh, that wing is flexing a bit, I'm more likely to think, aren't they brilliant, the engineers, the men and women who built these things, rather than, oh my goodness, we're all going to die.
Their cutting-edge designs and rigorous testing mean no amount of turbulence is going to drop a plane out of the sky.
No passenger jets have been involved in fatal accidents at all in 2023. That's an extraordinary achievement. I know that historically, aviation has never been safer.
But even the most knowledgeable scientists can react like the rest of us when the plane starts jumping about.
When you feel yourself lifting up out of your seat and all of the maths and all of the equations and all of the science can go to one side because it gets you at a really primitive level. You feel your heart starting to race. Even turbulent scientists are not immune to being a bit scared in a turbulence encounter. That's my confession.
Just weeks after the tragic events of SQ321, another dramatic encounter shows just how resilient modern planes are. On the 9th of June, an Austrian Airlines plane flies through an unexpected hailstorm on its descent into Vienna airport.
The Vienna incident is really interesting. I have never seen damage to an aircraft nose like that before.
Passengers scream as turbulence rocks the plane. The airline later claims the plane's radar failed to detect the storm.
Maybe the weather radar had some malfunction, or maybe it was just a very seldom and very rare situation where it wasn't big enough to be detected.
The hail rips the nose cone apart. But the damage isn't as severe as it appears.
It's important to say that the nose cone is just there to make the aircraft more aerodynamic. It covers the weather radar. It's lightweight. It's not structurally strong beyond the point at which it needs to be.
The hailstones also crack the cockpit windows.
And that presents, I believe, a more significant threat, in fact, than the damage to the nose cone.
The windows withstand the impact of the hail, but it could have been far worse. In 1990, a British Airways pilot was sucked out of the cockpit after the windows blew out. He'd removed the seatbelt shoulder straps shortly after takeoff. He survived the ordeal thanks to a colleague who held onto his legs while the plane made an emergency landing. On this Austrian Airlines plane, the sudden cracks in the window mean the pilots cannot see the runway. They must rely on autopilot to make a safe landing.
That was quite extreme. I've not seen anything like that before, but it did make a safe landing. And I think that's the focus of that story, particularly for people who are nervous about flying. Even when there was a level of damage to the aircraft like that, it still made a safe landing.
But while engineers have made huge strides in making the structure of a plane safe, there's little to protect passengers in the cabin if they're thrown about by turbulence.
When designing the aircraft, safety is the first thing we think about. That's of primary importance. The next thing that's probably on our minds is to reduce the weight of the aircraft. The interior is designed for absolutely minimal mass, so that's why we're not really realistically going to see things like padding appearing in the aircraft to deal with bumping into walls during turbulence.
In Bangkok, an hour after the turbulence hit Flight SQ321, medics are prioritising those who need to be stretchered off the aircraft.
Seeing the blood on their body, on their faces, on their head, realizing the severity of the damage from within the cabin, dents to the ceiling, all the oxygen masks that had come out, the blood that was on the armrests in front of me, I'd only just started to realize how bad it was.
After we landed, there was also a lady who started having a seizure behind us. I think just due to the panic. That in combination with people with blood stains, with cuts, it was like the worst thing you could imagine seeing in a flight.
No podía andar por mí mismo, iba así un poco encogido. Conseguimos bajar las escaleras, finalmente. Y bueno, es de decir que yo llevaba el collarín. Me recomendaron no quitármelo para evitar mover el cuello, porque como me dolía tanto a la espalda. Y de hecho es curioso, yo creo que me salvó la vida, porque, bueno, me fracturé una vértebra.
I had bruising on my thighs from the seat belt, which I didn't realise until I got home. Otherwise, I was completely uninjured just because of wearing that seatbelt.
Jeffrey Kitchen, who suffered a suspected heart attack during the devastating turbulence, has tragically died. Many other passengers have severe injuries, some of them life-changing, and are rushed to St. Vergisena Karen Hospital.
For our hospital, we receive 71 patients. We admit 41 patients to the ICU and 2 wards. I think we have more than 30 physicians involved. I think more than 200 nurses and paramedics involved in taking care at that night.
The most serious injuries are to passengers' necks and backs as a result of being thrown upwards at speed into the overhead lockers.
So it's the large number of spine injury. And we have 9 cases of emergency operation. So he operated through the night, continuously.
Passengers who were wearing seatbelts have escaped relatively unscathed.
I was very thankful that I was safe. I wasn't injured. A minor bruising to my waist and a bump on my head and a tiny scratch on my leg. You know, it was 7 o'clock in the morning. I wanted to have a shower. As I got undressed, I found blood on my shorts and some of my clothes and on the back of my leg, which I didn't even notice, which wasn't my blood. I didn't even know it was there. Had a shower and I had a good cry in the shower.
News of the flight soon makes headlines around the world. But it seems that cases of extreme turbulence are becoming more and more common, with passengers regularly sharing their terrifying experiences on social media. We may be hearing about it more, but is turbulence really getting worse?
Since satellites began observing the atmosphere in the 1970s, there's been a clear observed increase in the amount of turbulence in the atmosphere. For example, if we go to the North Atlantic Ocean, which is a very busy flight corridor, for every 3 patches of severe clear air turbulence in the atmosphere today, we know that 1 of those 3 is there because of climate change, and the other 2 would have been there anyway. In simple terms, what we're doing with climate change is putting more energy into the atmosphere, and basically more energy means more turbulence. If climate change continues unabated, we may see a point where 2 in every 3 patches of severe turbulence are there because of climate change and only 1 there naturally.
This 50% uplift in severe turbulence since the 1970s has also led to an increase in accidents on board flights. Between 2011 and 2024, there have been 248 cases of turbulence where at least 1 passenger has been seriously injured. Virtually no airline has been unaffected by turbulence. In July 2024, 30 passengers were injured when an Air Europa flight from Madrid to Montevideo hit severe turbulence over the Atlantic. Astonishingly, 1 man became stuck in the overhead locker as a result of being thrown upwards. But one of the most serious incidents was on Hawaii flight HA35 from Arizona to Honolulu in December 2022. 35 people were injured, including a 14-month-old baby. One case of severe turbulence occurs just 5 days after flight SQ321, when a young Irish couple are flying home from a holiday in Thailand on board a Qatar Airlines flight.
I had my headphones on and I was just watching a movie, trying to pass the time. And then out of nowhere, the plane just dropped. Very much like a roller coaster where you just feel it in your stomach. There's a bit of pandemonium going around. No one really knows what's going on. The first thing that I saw happen was the air hostess go up in the air. She got up suddenly and just told everyone to make sure you have your seatbelts on.
I just remember turning to Connor, I grabbed his arm and I was like, we're gonna be okay, as we were falling. And then I guess when everything kind of stopped, it was just kind of silence, I guess, for a second. We heard people crying, we heard babies crying, and everyone's just kind of looking around going, are you okay, are you okay? And I just started crying.
They don't know it at the time, but just like SQ321, their plane has encountered an unexpected patch of clear air turbulence.
It was very, very scary experience. But yeah, we just had to reassure ourselves that, we were together, and if anything did happen, we could just hold each other's hand and try to get through it,
12 people are injured in the sudden drop, but it could have been far worse if fewer had been wearing their seatbelts, as happened on the Singapore Airlines flight.
It can happen to any flight. We were just very, very grateful to be back home in Ireland and that we survived it.
As the world warms up and turbulence and the potential for passenger injuries increases, scientists are striving to come up with ways to tackle the problem in our skies. At Cranfield University in the UK, one of the aims is to reduce the impact of flying on global warming itself.
Aviation is around about 3% to blame for global warming, so we're working very hard on reducing aviation's footprint.
One way to do this is to look for alternative, more environmentally friendly fuels. Jet fuel is derived from crude oil and accounts for around 6% of the world's fuel production.
One of the solutions to decarbonise aviation is to use liquid hydrogen as the energy carrier so that we don't output any CO2 like the conventional jet fuel does.
But standard passenger jets simply aren't big enough to store the huge volume of liquid hydrogen needed for even a short flight. What's required is a radical overhaul to the basic design of a plane that's been with us for decades.
So this aircraft is a blended wing body configuration, so it looks quite different to present airliners. And it's a high passenger capacity aircraft, maybe 800 passengers, something like this. And if you want to carry liquid hydrogen, you need a very large volume available to you. And that's what this configuration gives you, a very large internal volume where we could accommodate these large liquid hydrogen tanks.
But if this radical design is a solution, it's not one that's coming anytime soon.
We might be talking about a couple of decades before we see aircraft like this, because in the aerospace industry, we move forward relatively slowly just to make sure that we're maintaining the safety of the industry.
For For now, scientists are trying to find ways to improve the forecasting of turbulence so planes can avoid it as much as possible.
When I started working on turbulence forecasting 20 years ago, we were able to accurately forecast about half of all turbulence that's out there in the skies. And we've seen an increase from 50% accuracy to about 75%.
That improvement has come about by combining radar technology with artificial intelligence.
They have ground radar, which allows them to see the overall development of the thunderstorms in the area. And they have radar on the plane itself. They then use a machine learning model that can predict, okay, based on these radar measurements and these plane measurements, there should be convective turbulence activity.
But despite the skies above Myanmar being notorious for turbulence because its position near the equator causes low pressure, the country doesn't have the sophisticated ground radar that can help spot it.
The pilots did not have that information at hand and had to rely simply on the radar in front of their plane and satellite images.
If the Singapore Airlines pilots were relying on their onboard radar, which can't spot clear air turbulence, it would explain why the dramatic events of Flight SQ321 were so sudden.
The incident happened so suddenly.
It just felt like we went on an unexpected vertical roller coaster.
It's hoped better infrastructure, cooperation between countries' air traffic control, and improved computer modelling will eventually lead to more accurate forecasting in the decades to come.
I may regret this in 20 years' time when my kids play it back to me when I've retired, but I think we can make massive inroads into forecasting that final 25% of turbulence that today we just can't do.
With 1 in 4 patches of turbulence remaining hidden from radar, what can engineers do to smooth out our bumpy flights? One company in Austria is developing a system which adjusts small flaps in the wings to cancel out the effects of turbulence.
So our solution is actively counter the turbulence. So just like birds do all the time, we adapt the shape of the wing with small flaps. Just imagine you're sitting in this aircraft and you get bumped up and down. What we do is a down and up motion. So that's perfectly canceling out the motion. And your stomach just has a perfect flight.
In this computer-generated model, the plane on the right is being buffeted by moderate turbulence. But the plane on the left has a smoother ride because onboard pressure sensors detect even clear air turbulence immediately ahead of the wing. The sensors electronically control movement of the wing flaps so they continually adapt to changes in airflow.
What we are really looking into is very short time notice. So it's just like the next 0.1 second, 30 milliseconds, looking a little bit ahead of the wing. So we know exactly the flow, not just is there turbulence, but what type of turbulence.
For now, the system is offered on small planes, but the aim is to fit it to large passenger planes within 10 to 15 years and prevent a similar tragedy to SQ321.
So even the Singapore flight could be largely reduced. It doesn't mean that we can reduce completely, but you don't have this large impact of being forced up to the ceiling anymore.
3 weeks after Flight SQ321, Iago Pereda is fit enough to return to Spain. He and his wife must now summon the courage to step aboard another long-haul flight home.
Como a las 2 horas y media de vuelo, empezaron las turbulencias y fue horrible.
Creo que duraron como 5 horas las turbulencias. En plan, ¿qué me han hecho? Lo pague, quiero decir, vale, si me recupero físicamente es lo primero, obviamente, pero nunca más voy a poder disfrutar de un vuelo. Pues Dios mío, no puedo con estas turbulencias.
Alongside his mental anguish, it'll be many weeks before Iago's neck is fully recovered.
El médico de allí me decía que 2 meses, 3 meses, pero vida normal en cuanto a volver a hacer deporte, ejercicio, cosas así. Depende, ¿no? Pero me dijo de 4 hasta 6 meses.
The other passengers must also deal with the trauma they experienced in the skies above Myanmar.
So those individuals who had bad experience, whether it's in an aircraft or another environment where they've experienced a lack of control, they're more likely to experience the negative associated with turbulence.
I live under the flight path here in London, and it's not so bad now, but I do hear aeroplanes going ahead, and it's like a constant a constant reminder on what happened.
And I guess it's just that sudden feeling of panic in my heart now whenever I hit any kind of turbulence that it might get bad.
Definitely take a bit more of like a mental toughness to like fly regularly again.
I get flashbacks of the incident. It was truly one of those moments that stick in your head for the rest of your life.
3 people remain in hospital in Bangkok 6 weeks after the accident. An international treaty called the Montreal Convention requires airlines to compensate anyone injured by turbulence, regardless of whether they could have prevented it. 20 days after the flight, Singapore Airlines makes passengers an offer.
Singapore Airlines was pretty quick off the mark, saying, OK, anybody who was mildly injured, we're very sorry, here's $10,000, and increasing the amounts that they were paying to people who were very sadly, badly injured as a result of the turbulence.
With the planet warming up and turbulence becoming more common, what should we all be doing when we fly to avoid injuries on board?
If you were sitting in a car, you wouldn't just think, oh, it's a long journey, I'm not going to keep my seatbelt on. It just doesn't make sense. So why do it on an aircraft? Keep your seatbelt fastened. It's going to keep you safe.
Regardless whether your seatbelt sign is on or not, just keep it on. Obviously get up and go to the toilet. Once you're seated, put it back on. Even if it's loose, it's still going to prevent you from flying up to the ceiling.
I conducted a social media poll. I asked the question, should seatbelt wearing be mandatory on passenger flights unless you're actually using the washroom? And I was really surprised to find that of the self-selecting respondents, there was a majority of 5 to 1 saying, yeah, make it mandatory.
The best thing to do is to minimise the things that you have about you. You know, if you've got laptop computers, for example, put them away in the overhead locker rather than just leaving them beside you on the seat where they could be released in a turbulence encounter. Otherwise, the best thing I can do is reiterate the advice I've given on every welcome on board announcement over the last 20 years, which is to keep your seatbelt fastened at all times that you're in your seat.
I feel fine. I'm determined not to stop flying. I know full well I'll be aware of every single bump and shake and jolt, but I will make absolutely triple sure that my seatbelt is fastened at all times.